Before we begin, I want you to do something. Take a breath. Settle in. Whatever time it is where you are, whatever worries followed you here, let them go for the next couple of hours. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you in Tokyo at 3 a.m., London at midnight, New York as the sun sets? It doesn't matter. Time, for the next while, is irrelevant. This isn't going to be your typical history video. We're about to walk through 3,000 years of human cruelty, but I need you to understand something first. This isn't about shock value. This isn't about gore. This is about understanding a simple, uncomfortable truth. For most of human history, inflicting pain on other humans was considered not just acceptable, but necessary, legal, even righteous. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and forget about time. Because we're going on a journey through the darkest corridors of human civilization, and by the end, you'll understand something fundamental about our species that most people spend their lives avoiding. Let's begin where much of recorded cruelty begins, in the ancient world where empires rose on foundations of fear. The Assyrian Empire, at its height around 700 BCE, controlled much of the ancient Near East. They were administrators, architects, and artists. They were also perhaps the most systematically cruel civilization in recorded history. But here's what's interesting. They wanted you to know about it. They carved their methods into stone, had scribes record them in detail, commissioned artists to render them in relief sculptures that lined palace walls. This wasn't hidden away. This was propaganda. The Assyrians understood something about human psychology that wouldn't be formally studied for another 2.5 millennia. Fear is more powerful than force. You can conquer a city with 10,000 soldiers, or you can make one example so horrifying that the next 10 cities surrender without a fight. They chose the latter, and they documented everything. Impalement was their signature. Not the quick, merciful version you might imagine. The Assyrian method involved a long wooden stake, carefully shaped and oiled. The victim would be positioned so the stake entered through the lower body, and over hours or sometimes days, would slowly work its way upward through the torso. The skill lay in avoiding major organs and blood vessels. Death wasn't the point, at least not immediately. The point was that someone could be alive, visible from a distance for days. Entire forests of these stakes would line the roads leading to rebellious cities. Thousands of people, dying slowly, visible for miles. But impalement was just one tool in an extensive repertoire. The Assyrians would flay people alive, starting with small cuts, peeling back the skin in strips. The skin would then be displayed on city walls or draped over siege equipment. Again, this was documented, recorded, celebrated. King Ashurnasirpal II had scribes write, "I flayed all the chief men who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins." He wasn't confessing, he was boasting. What's particularly striking about Assyrian cruelty is its bureaucratic nature. This wasn't random violence. There were officials specifically tasked with punishment, craftsmen who built the equipment, artists who recorded it all. It was institutionalized, systematized, made part of the machinery of state. When we think about the banality of evil, about how ordinary people participate in extraordinary cruelty, the Assyrians wrote the playbook 27 centuries before Hannah Arendt coined the term. The Persian Empire, which succeeded the Assyrians, had a different approach, though no less calculated. Scaphism, as the Greeks called it, was perhaps their most inventive contribution to the catalogue of human suffering. The name comes from the Greek word for boat, and that tells you something about the method. 2 boats or hollowed logs would be placed together, creating a confined space with only the victim's head, hands and feet exposed. The person would be force-fed milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea. More honey would be poured over their exposed body parts, particularly the face. Then they'd be left floating in a stagnant pond or marsh. The insects would come first. Flies, then wasps drawn by the honey. They'd feed on the exposed flesh, lay eggs in the wounds. The victim, immobilized, would be forced to continue consuming milk and honey daily, their own waste accumulating in the confined space below them. The combination of insect activity, infection from the waste, and sepsis from countless small wounds would lead to death, but it could take more than 2 weeks. The Greek historian Plutarch described the death of a soldier named Mithridates who had accidentally killed the king's son. After 17 days in the Scaphism apparatus, Plutarch wrote that when they finally opened it, Worms and other vermin had consumed his body from the inside while his face remained visible, eaten away by the swarms of insects. The Persians, who kept detailed records, noted that Mithridates had remained conscious for most of those 17 days. The innovation here wasn't just cruelty, it was the use of nature itself as an instrument of punishment. The executioner didn't have to do much after the initial setup. The world itself became the weapon. Infection, insects, the victim's own bodily functions all turned against them in an enclosed space from which there was no escape and no relief. Ancient Rome approached punishment with characteristic pragmatism. Crucifixion, which we associate so strongly with one particular historical execution, was actually a common punishment for slaves, pirates, and enemies of the state. The Romans didn't invent it. They inherited it from the Carthaginians, but they perfected it, industrialized it, made it routine. Here's what most people don't understand about crucifixion. It's a death by suffocation. When you hang by your arms, your chest cavity compresses. To breathe, you have to push up on your feet, which are nailed or tied to the cross, but this causes excruciating pain in the feet and legs. Eventually exhaustion sets in. You can no longer push up. Your chest can't expand. You suffocate, but slowly, over hours or even days. The Romans understood this mechanics perfectly. They would adjust the height of the footrest depending on how long they wanted the process to take. After major slave revolts, like the one led by Spartacus in 71 BCE, they lined the Appian Way from Capua to Rome with 6,000 crosses, 6,000 men dying slowly along one of Rome's major highways. It took weeks for all of them to die. The crosses remained for months afterward as a warning, but crucifixion, for all its horror, was almost pedestrian compared to some of Rome's more creative sentences. Being sewn into a sack with animals and thrown into the Tiber was reserved for particularly heinous crimes, especially parricide. The condemned would be placed in a leather sack with a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey, then thrown into the river. The symbolism was important to the Romans. Each animal represented a different betrayal of natural order. What's fascinating about Roman punishment is how public it was, and yet how normalized. The arena games, where people were torn apart by animals or forced to fight to the death, weren't seen as particularly unusual. They were entertainment. Thousands would gather to watch. Vendors would sell food. It was a day out. The casual nature of it, the way extreme violence was woven into the fabric of daily life, tells us something about how humans can adapt to almost anything if it's presented as normal. The Romans also pioneered the concept of juridical torture. Torture not as punishment, but as investigation. If you were a slave accused of a crime, your testimony was only considered valid if it was extracted under duress. The Romans believed that pain forced truth, that suffering burned away lies. This idea, that torture could be a path to truth rather than just punishment, would echo through the centuries and find its fullest expression in medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, torture became not just a tool of punishment or investigation, but a theological instrument. The Catholic Church during the Inquisition developed an entire philosophy around the extraction of truth through pain. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, the inquisitors would have told you. This was saving souls. Physical suffering was temporary. Eternal damnation was forever. From that perspective, any amount of earthly pain was justified if it led to confession and salvation. The Inquisition's methods were meticulously documented. The Spanish Inquisition in particular kept detailed records of every session, every technique, every confession. These records still exist. Thousands of pages of careful bureaucratic notation describing acts of calculated cruelty. The strappado was common. The victim's hands would be tied behind their back, then they'd be hoisted up by a rope attached to their wrists. Gravity would dislocate the shoulders. They'd be left hanging, sometimes for hours. Sometimes weights would be added to their feet to increase the pressure. The rack was another standard tool. The victim would be laid on a wooden frame, their ankles and wrists attached to rollers. The rollers would be turned slowly, stretching the body. The pain was extraordinary. Joints would separate, tendons would tear, sometimes limbs would simply be pulled from their sockets. But here's what's crucial. Trained operators knew exactly how far to go without causing death. They could keep someone on the rack for hours, extracting confession after confession, prayer after prayer. The Iron Maiden, despite its fame, was probably never used in the way popular culture suggests. The famous spiked sarcophagus that supposedly closed on victims, impaling them, appears to be a later invention. possibly created for torture museums in the 19th century. But the fact that we believe it existed, that we've created elaborate mythology around it, tells us something about our fascination with historical cruelty. We want to believe the past was more barbaric than it was, perhaps to make ourselves feel more civilized by comparison. What did exist, extensively documented, was the practice of burning. Not just burning at the stake for heresy, though that happened often enough, but burning as a preliminary to other tortures. Feet would be held over hot coals during interrogation. Red-hot pincers would be used to tear flesh. Branding irons would mark the convicted. The combination of heat and pain was considered particularly effective at extracting confessions, and the church kept careful records of how long someone could typically withstand each type of burning before they would confess to whatever their interrogators wanted to hear. The question of false confessions was actually debated by church officials. Some argued that innocents would confess to crimes they didn't commit just to make the pain stop. Others maintained that God would give the innocent strength to resist. But the practices continued because they served a purpose beyond truth-finding. They demonstrated the power of the church, the totality of its authority over both body and soul. In England, the use of pressing emerged as a particularly strange form of torture. If someone refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty, they couldn't be tried, and if they couldn't be tried, their property couldn't be confiscated. This created a perverse incentive. Remain silent, endure torture, die without a conviction, and your family keeps your estate. The torture was simple. The accused would be laid on the ground, a board placed on their chest, and stones added one by one until they either entered a plea or died. Giles Corey, during the Salem witch trials in 1692, was pressed for 3 days. Each time they asked for his plea, he supposedly said only more weight. He died without pleading, and his estate passed to his sons rather than being seized. His last words, according to witnesses, were not a confession or a plea, but that simple, defiant phrase, more weight. The courage required to endure that, to choose slow, crushing death over a quick hanging that would have left your family destitute, suggests something about human capacity for endurance, when motivation is strong enough. Asia developed its own rich tradition of institutional cruelty, often with different philosophical underpinnings than European methods. In China, the practice of lingqi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts, was used for the most serious crimes from roughly the 10th century until its abolition in 1905. The condemned would be systematically cut, piece by piece, sometimes over several days. The skill of the executioner was in keeping the victim alive and conscious for as long as possible. Photographs exist of lingqi executions from the early 20th century. These are some of the only photographs of any historical torture method being carried out. They're difficult to look at, not just because of what they show, but because of what they tell us about how recently these practices were still common. People in the photographs are dressed in clothing that wouldn't look out of place today. There are crowds watching, some with the blank expressions of routine observation, others with what looks like curiosity or even entertainment. The philosophy behind lingqi was different from Western torture. It wasn't about extracting confession or demonstrating religious authority. It was about balance. The criminal had disturbed the social order, and their punishment must restore it. The severity of the crime determined how many cuts would be administered. For treason or parricide, it could be thousands. The executioner would work from a prescribed pattern, documented in manuals that were passed down through generations of practitioners. What's particularly striking is how systematized it was. There were specific sequences, specific numbers of cuts for different crimes, specific ways of ensuring the victim remained conscious. It was a craft, with apprentices and masters, techniques and traditions. The banality of it, the bureaucratic precision applied to the infliction of maximum suffering, parallels what we saw in Assyria 2.5 millennia earlier. Humans, across vast geographical and temporal distances, keep arriving at the same conclusion. Cruelty is most effective when it's organised. Japan had its own traditions. Crucifixion was practised, but with variations. Victims might be crucified upside down, or suspended above water level during high tide, slowly drowning as the tide came in over hours, then being exposed again as it retreated, only to drown again with the next tide. This could continue for days. The psychological torture of knowing exactly when the next submersion would come, of counting the hours, of drowning repeatedly, added a dimension beyond the physical suffering. bamboo torture, despite being widely discussed, may be more legend than historical fact, but it tells us about perceptions of Asian cruelty in the Western imagination. The idea was that a victim would be tied over a young bamboo shoot, which can grow nearly a metre per day under ideal conditions. The shoot would slowly grow through the victim's body over several days. Whether this actually occurred is questionable, there's limited documentation, but the fact that it's so widely believed as historical fact is interesting in itself. What is well documented is the Japanese practice of boiling. Large cauldrons of water or oil would be brought to boiling temperature, and the condemned would be lowered in slowly, sometimes feet first, sometimes head first, depending on the crime. Witnesses described how the water would initially turn red, then how the flesh would separate from bone, the process taking anywhere from several minutes to an hour depending on the temperature and the method of immersion. In Southeast Asia, particularly in the Khmer Empire and later in Siam, execution by elephant was common for several centuries. This wasn't quick trampling. Elephants were trained specifically for execution. They could be commanded to crush specific body parts slowly, keeping the victim alive as long as possible. An elephant could be instructed to place its foot on a victim's chest and press down gradually, crushing the rib cage over minutes, or to tear limbs off one at a time, or to gore with tusks in non-lethal ways before finally administering a killing blow. What made this particularly effective as both punishment and spectacle was the intelligence of elephants. They could follow complex commands, adjust pressure, wait for instructions. The executioner, often mounted on the elephant, would direct the process like a conductor, and the crowd could see the victim's suffering prolonged through what appeared to be the animal's own cruelty, though of course it was simply following training. The Mughal Empire in India had its own methods. One particularly inventive punishment involved cutting off the hands and feet of criminals, then hanging them on city gates. But not all at once. First the right hand, cauterized to prevent death from blood loss. Then, days later, the left hand. Then the feet, one at a time, sometimes over weeks. The victim would be kept alive throughout, displayed as a warning. The psychological torture of knowing what was coming, of living without hands and knowing your feet were next, added a dimension beyond the physical mutilation. The Ottoman Empire employed various forms of impalement, though with refinements. The Turkish method reportedly avoided organs more carefully than the Assyrian, and victims could survive for days. There are accounts of impaled criminals who would talk to passers-by, begging for water or for someone to push them further onto the stake to hasten death. The cruelty of keeping someone alive while impaled, conscious and able to communicate, unable to move or escape is almost incomprehensible. Vlad III of Wallachia, known as Vlad the Impaler, took Ottoman impalement techniques and turned them into a form of psychological warfare. In 1462, when Sultan Mehmed II marched on Wallachia with an army vastly larger than Vlad's forces, he encountered a forest of impaled bodies. 20,000 people, impaled on stakes arranged in concentric circles outside the capital. The Sultan, who had seen plenty of cruelty in his campaigns, was reportedly so disturbed by the sight that he turned his army around. Vlad understood what the Assyrians had understood 17 centuries earlier. Extreme cruelty can be a force multiplier. 20,000 deaths prevented a battle that might have cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But we need to be careful here. The historical record around Vlad is complicated by propaganda, both from his enemies and from later Romanian nationalism that turned him into a defender of Christendom. Some accounts may be exaggerated. What's not in dispute is that impalement was common across Eastern Europe and the Middle East during this period, and that Vlad used it extensively. Whether he impaled 20,000 or 2,000, whether it was as elaborate as described or simpler, the fundamental horror remains. Medieval Europe had a strange category of punishment, reserved specifically for traitors, hanged, drawn, and quartered. The name barely captures the full process. The condemned would be dragged through streets on a wooden hurdle, often for miles, the rough wood tearing at their back and legs. Then they'd be hanged, but carefully, not dropped far enough to break the neck. They'd strangle slowly, losing consciousness but not dying. While still alive, they'd be cut down and laid on a table. The executioner would make an incision in the abdomen and pull out the intestines, while the victim was still conscious, sometimes burning them in front of the victim. Then the genitals would be cut off. Only then would they be beheaded. Finally, the body would be cut into quarters, and the pieces displayed in different parts of the kingdom. The most famous victim of this was probably William Wallace, the Scottish knight, in 1305. After his execution, his head was placed on London Bridge, his right arm displayed in Newcastle, his left arm in Berwick, his right leg in Perth, and his left in Aberdeen. The message was clear: rebel against the crown, and not only will you die horribly, but your body will be scattered so thoroughly that even in death you'll find no peace. What's particularly striking about this punishment is how long it remained in use. The last person to be hanged, drawn and quartered in England was in 1820, just 2 centuries ago. This wasn't ancient history. This was happening in the age of Beethoven and Jane Austen. The crowd that gathered to watch could have gone home and read the newspaper, discussed it in coffeehouses that wouldn't look entirely unfamiliar to us today. Modernity and barbarity coexisted more recently than we typically acknowledge. Speaking of modernity, the guillotine is often presented as a humanitarian innovation, and in a sense it was. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine didn't invent the device, but he advocated for it as a more egalitarian and less painful method of execution. Before the guillotine, execution methods in France varied by social class. Nobles were beheaded with a sword, which could be quick if the executioner was skilled. Commoners were hanged, which was slower and less reliable. The guillotine would be the same for everyone, and death would be instantaneous. Except there was debate, even then, about whether it was truly instantaneous. After the blade fell, some heads appeared to show signs of consciousness. Eyes would move, mouths would work. In one famous case, a doctor named Gabriel Bourrieu attended the execution of a man named Henri Languille in 1905. Immediately after the head was severed, Bourrieu called Languille's name. He reported that the eyes opened and focused on him, unmistakably aware. He called the name again, and again the eyes responded. The third time, there was no response. Whether this was a real consciousness or just nerve reflexes is debated, but the question troubled witnesses. The guillotine was supposed to be humane, instantaneous, painless. But what if consciousness persisted for seconds or even minutes after decapitation? What if, in trying to be more humane, they'd created a new form of torture, being aware of your own severed head, unable to breathe, unable to move, slowly fading? The thought is almost worse than slower deaths, because it combines physical trauma with complete, conscious helplessness. The guillotine operated in France until 1977. The last person executed by guillotine, Hamida Djandoubi, was killed the same year Star Wars came out. This isn't ancient history. There are people alive today who witnessed guillotine executions. The gap between historical cruelty and the present day is far narrower than our comfortable historical narratives suggest. In colonial settings, European powers often combined their own traditions of cruelty with local methods, creating new hybrids. The Belgian Congo under King Leopold II saw systematic torture used as a tool of economic exploitation. Workers who failed to meet rubber quotas would have their hands cut off. Not killed, just maimed, sent back to their villages as warnings to others. The scale was industrial. Tens of thousands of people systematically mutilated as part of a bureaucratic system designed to maximize rubber production. What makes the Congo particularly disturbing is how recent it was, how well documented, and how the perpetrators saw themselves as civilized men bringing progress to Africa. There are photographs, official reports, witness testimony. The men carrying out these mutilations weren't particularly cruel by nature. They were administrators, clerks, merchants. They had families back in Europe. They wrote letters home about the weather and their health. They were ordinary people participating in an extraordinary system of cruelty because the system made it normal, even rewarded it. The British Empire had its own traditions. In India, during various rebellions and uprisings, execution by cannon was used. The condemned would be tied to the mouth of a cannon which would then be fired. The result was instant and extremely graphic. Body parts would be scattered over a wide area. This served multiple purposes. It was a terrifying spectacle for witnesses. It made martyrdom impossible. There was no intact body to become a rallying point. And it was quick, which the British considered more humane than slower methods. But humane is relative. The psychological torture of being tied to a cannon, hearing the fuse being lit, knowing what was about to happen, may have been worse than the instant of obliteration. And for witnesses, forced to watch as dozens or sometimes hundreds of people were executed this way in sequence, the trauma was intentional. The British wanted local populations to understand the totality of imperial power, to see resistance as not just futile, but horrifying in its consequences. Transportation to penal colonies, while not torture in the traditional sense, created conditions that amounted to slow death for many. Australia received over 160,000 convicts from Britain between 1788 and 1868. The journey itself, lasting months in cramped, disease-ridden ships, killed roughly 1 in 10. Those who survived faced brutal conditions, harsh labour, and a legal system that could add years or decades to sentences for minor infractions. Similar systems operated in French Guiana, where Devil's Island became synonymous with slow death in tropical heat and disease. Of the 80,000 prisoners sent there between 1852 and 1946, only about 2,000 ever returned to France. Most died of disease, malnutrition, or violence. The cruelty was systemic rather than individual. No one was being actively tortured, but the system itself was designed to break people physically and psychologically. Russia's development of the Katorga system, forced labour camps in Siberia, followed a similar logic. Prisoners would be marched thousands of miles, often in chains, in brutal winter conditions. The journey itself could take a year or more. Many died en route. Those who survived faced years or decades of forced labour in mines or lumber camps in some of the harshest environments on Earth. The system was formalised, bureaucratic, legal. It wasn't officially torture, it was criminal punishment. But the death rates speak for themselves. These systems reveal something important about human cruelty. Sometimes the most effective torture isn't dramatic or immediate. It's bureaucratic, systemic, spread out over months or years. It's the slow grinding down of human beings through sustained deprivation and labour. There's no single moment of extreme pain, just the accumulated weight of endless days in conditions designed to break the body and spirit. The 20th century industrialised cruelty in ways that would have been incomprehensible to earlier eras. The scale became almost abstract. In the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, in the gulags of the Soviet Union, in the killing fields of Cambodia, in the prisons of countless dictatorships, torture and death became assembly line processes. The intimacy was removed. You didn't know the person you were hurting. You were just following procedures, filling quotas, obeying orders. The methods varied. In Nazi concentration camps, medical experimentation combined torture with science. Prisoners were subjected to hypothermia experiments, pressure experiments, infectious disease studies, all conducted with scientific rigour and detailed documentation. The doctors performing these experiments had medical degrees from prestigious universities. They took notes, wrote papers, discussed their findings. They saw themselves as scientists, not torturers. Similarly, in the Soviet Gulag system, the torture was often systemic rather than individual. Insufficient food, inadequate shelter, impossible work quotas, all within a legal framework. Prisoners would be tried, sentenced, transported, worked until they died or their sentence ended, all with proper paperwork and bureaucratic oversight. The cruelty was in the system itself. Psychological torture emerged as a recognised category in the 20th century. The Nazis and Soviets both experimented with sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, and various forms of psychological pressure. The insight was that you could break someone without touching them. Keep them in isolation long enough, deny them sleep, create uncertainty about what will happen next, and the mind destroys itself. The CIA, in the 1950s and 60s, formalised these insights through programs like MKULTRA. They studied coercive interrogation techniques, experimented with sensory deprivation, developed manuals on psychological torture. The QBARC manual, declassified decades later, reads like a scientific paper. It discusses techniques like temporal disorientation, manipulating environmental conditions, inducing psychological regression, all described in neutral clinical language as if discussing crop yields or chemical reactions. What's particularly disturbing about 20th century torture is how it combined bureaucratic systematization with scientific rationalization. Torturers could tell themselves they were following procedures, conducting research, serving a greater good. The individual act of cruelty was diffused through layers of abstraction. You weren't hurting a person, you were implementing policy. You weren't causing pain, you were extracting intelligence. The language created distance from the reality. In Latin America during the Cold War, various military dictatorships developed torture into a science. The Argentinian military dictatorship, which disappeared an estimated 30,000 people between 1976 and 1983, operated clandestine detention centres where torture was systematic and sophisticated. Victims would be subjected to electric shocks, near drowning, prolonged suspension in stress positions, all while being kept blindfolded and disoriented about location and time. The genius, if we can use such a word, was in the combination of physical and psychological torture. Victims never knew where they were, what time it was, how long they'd been held. They'd hear screams from other prisoners, never sure if those were real or recordings. They'd be told family members had been captured, or released, or killed, never sure what was true. The physical pain was terrible, but the psychological dismantling was often more effective at breaking resistance. Chile under Pinochet, Brazil under its military dictatorship, Uruguay, Paraguay all developed similar systems. And these weren't isolated experiments. They shared techniques, training, personnel. The School of the Americas, run by the US military, trained Latin American officers in interrogation techniques. Manuals have been declassified showing that torture techniques were taught, rationalized as necessary in the fight against communism. The insight here is that 20th century torture often worked by inverting the relationship between physical and psychological pain. Traditional torture focused on physical suffering, with psychological trauma as a side effect. Modern torture often focused on psychological breakdown, with physical pain as merely a tool to achieve that. Sleep deprivation, isolation, disorientation, uncertainty. These could be more effective than any amount of physical torture, and they left fewer marks. In the Middle East, various regimes developed their own traditions. Saddam Hussein's Iraq used torture extensively, documented in testimonies after the regime's fall. The techniques ranged from traditional, beatings, burnings, to more sophisticated psychological methods. What's particularly notable is how normalized it became. A substantial percentage of Iraq's adult population during Hussein's rule had either experienced torture directly or knew someone who had. It became part of the social fabric, an omnipresent threat that controlled behavior. Syria under the Assad family developed similar systems. The testimony from survivors of Syrian military prisons describes conditions designed to break humans systematically. Overcrowded cells where prisoners couldn't lie down, systematic beatings, electric shocks, suspension in stress positions for days, all conducted within a legal framework where the tortured had officially been arrested and detained. The pattern repeats across the world. In North Korea, the network of political prison camps holds an estimated 200,000 people. Though exact numbers are impossible to verify, survivor testimony describes systematic torture, starvation rations, forced labour, executions. What makes North Korea unique is the multi-generational aspect. Families can be imprisoned for crimes of a single member, spending their entire lives in camps for something a grandparent or parent allegedly did. We've come to the present day, and here's what's striking. While the most extreme forms of torture have been officially banned, classified as crimes against humanity, the reality is more complex. Torture hasn't ended, it's evolved. Enhanced interrogation techniques, as the US called them after 9/11, included waterboarding, which is a carefully calibrated form of simulated drowning, along with stress positions, temperature manipulation, sleep deprivation, all designed to break the subject psychologically while technically leaving minimal physical marks. The genius of modern torture, from the torturer's perspective, is deniability. Traditional torture left evidence. Bodies bore marks. Modern psychological torture leaves mostly invisible scars. Someone subjected to weeks of sleep deprivation and isolation might be permanently traumatized, but there's no clear physical evidence. This makes it legally ambiguous, politically deniable, and in some ways more insidious than historical methods. But let's step back and consider what 3,000 years of torture tells us about human nature. It's not a comfortable conclusion. Every culture, every civilization, every era has developed its own methods of inflicting suffering on other humans. The techniques vary, the justifications change, but the fundamental willingness to cause pain persists. What changes over time isn't whether torture happens, but how we justify it and how we distance ourselves from it. The Assyrians were open about their cruelty. They celebrated it. Medieval Europeans wrapped it in theology. 20th century regimes bureaucratized it. made it systematic and impersonal. Modern democracies outsource it, create legal grey areas, use clinical language. The other constant is that ordinary people participate. The stereotype of the sadistic torturer, someone who enjoys pain, is actually relatively rare in historical records. Most torture has been carried out by ordinary people who saw themselves as doing their job, following orders, serving their society. This is perhaps the most disturbing realization. The capacity for cruelty isn't limited to monsters, it's latent in normal humans when the right conditions exist. What are those conditions? Authority structures that diffuse responsibility, dehumanization of victims, strong in-group/out-group distinctions, ideological justifications that frame cruelty as necessary, training and normalization that make the act routine, distance, either physical or psychological, between the torturer and victim's humanity. When these elements align, ordinary people can commit extraordinary cruelty. There's also the question of effectiveness. Does torture work? For punishment and deterrence, arguably yes. For extracting reliable information, the evidence is mixed at best. People under torture will say whatever they think their torturers want to hear. They'll confess to crimes they didn't commit, provide information that's false, just to make the pain stop. This has been known for centuries, debated by inquisitors and interrogators across eras, and yet torture for information continues. Why? Partly because it's psychologically satisfying for the torturer or the regime. There's a deep human desire for retribution, for making wrongdoers suffer. Torture satisfies that even if it doesn't provide reliable information, and it sends a message. Torture demonstrates power, creates fear, establishes dominance. These functions persist regardless of whether any useful information is obtained. The technological dimension is worth considering. Throughout history, each era's torture methods reflected its technological capabilities. Stone Age humans had rocks and fire. Ancient civilizations developed metal tools, specialized implements. Medieval Europe had elaborate devices. The 20th century added electricity, drugs, psychological techniques based on emerging understanding of the brain. What will future torture look like as our technological capabilities expand? It's not a comfortable question, but it's worth asking. Brain scanning technology might eventually allow direct measurement of pain and fear. Drugs might be developed that maximize suffering without causing unconsciousness. Virtual reality could create psychological torture scenarios that feel completely real. As our understanding of neuroscience advances, so too will our theoretical capacity to cause suffering in increasingly sophisticated ways. But perhaps technology will also make torture obsolete. If we develop better investigative tools, better crime prevention, better understanding of psychology and rehabilitation, maybe the perceived need for torture diminishes. This is optimistic, possibly naive, but worth considering. The question is whether our moral development can keep pace with our technological capabilities. Looking at these 3 millennia, certain patterns emerge. Torture tends to increase during periods of social stress, conflict, or rapid change. It tends to target outsiders, minorities, the politically powerless. It's often justified by appeals to security, religion, or social order. The methods become more sophisticated over time, but the fundamental motivations remain remarkably consistent. The abolition of torture, at least officially, in most countries is recent, mostly within the last 2 centuries. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 explicitly prohibited torture. The UN Convention Against Torture in 1984 created international legal frameworks. But these are recent developments in the long arc of human history, and their application remains inconsistent. Even in countries that have officially banned torture, questions remain. Is solitary confinement torture? Many psychologists argue yes, that extended isolation causes severe psychological damage. Is the death penalty torture? Botched executions suggest that what we consider humane methods may cause significant suffering. Are conditions in many prisons torture? Overcrowding, violence, inadequate medical care, all can cause sustained suffering. The line between legitimate punishment and torture is often culturally determined and historically contingent. What one era or culture considers acceptable punishment, another considers torture. There's no objective standard, just evolving social norms and legal definitions that reflect the values and power structures of any given moment. Some philosophers argue that torture is absolutely universally wrong, a violation of human dignity that can never be justified. Others take a utilitarian view. arguing that in extreme circumstances, the suffering of one person might be justified to prevent greater suffering. The ticking time bomb scenario, could you torture a terrorist to find a bomb that will kill thousands, is debated endlessly. But these philosophical debates often ignore the practical reality. Torture is rarely used in such clean scenarios. It's used against the powerless, the suspected, those who lack the means to resist. There's also the question of who gets to define what counts as torture. The powerful rarely admit to torturing. They use euphemisms, legal distinctions, technical definitions that exclude their own practices while condemning others. Enhanced interrogation, preventive detention, police brutality. These terms all describe practices that cause suffering but avoid the word torture. The victims of torture, across history, have been disproportionately the poor, minorities, the politically marginal. When torture is directed at the powerful, at elites, at those with voice and status, it tends to provoke reform. When it's directed at the powerless, it can continue for centuries with minimal opposition. This tells us something about torture being not just about inflicting pain, but about maintaining social hierarchies and power structures. Religious and ideological convictions have justified enormous amounts of torture throughout history. The Spanish Inquisition tortured to save souls. Communist regimes tortured to build a better society. Fascist regimes tortured to purify the nation. Democratic societies tortured to protect freedom. Every major ideology has found ways to rationalize inflicting suffering on those deemed dangerous or deviant. The role of the spectator is fascinating. Public torture, public executions, these were intended to send messages to witnesses as much as to punish the victim. The crowd's reaction, whether horror, approval or indifference, shaped how torture functioned socially. Modern torture is usually hidden, conducted in secret facilities, denied officially. This change reflects shifting social norms, but also makes torture easier to continue. What's invisible is harder to oppose. Documentation of torture creates its own ethical problems. The photographs from Abu Ghraib, the CIA torture memos, historical accounts of torture, all serve as records of human cruelty. But they also risk normalizing it, satisfying prurient interest, or being used as propaganda. How do we remember and learn from historical torture without either glorifying it or becoming desensitized to it? The survivors of torture face unique challenges. Physical wounds may heal, but psychological trauma often persists for life. PTSD, depression, anxiety, difficulty forming relationships, all are common. Many survivors describe feeling that they can never fully return to who they were before. Part of them remains in that room, in that moment, forever. This lasting damage is part of torture's purpose, to break someone so thoroughly that they never fully recover. There are organisations now dedicated to treating torture survivors, documenting torture, working toward its abolition. They face enormous challenges. How do you heal someone whose trust in humanity has been fundamentally shattered? How do you document crimes that governments deny? How do you create accountability when the powerful are the ones torturing? The economic aspect of torture is rarely discussed but significant. Torture chambers must be built, equipment manufactured, torturers trained. Someone profits from this. Companies manufacture shackles, electric shock devices, chemicals used in interrogation. They sell to governments, often with few questions asked. The business of torture, like the business of weapons, creates economic incentives that can perpetuate practices even when public opinion turns against them. Training torturers raises disturbing questions. How do you teach someone to inflict suffering? What happens to a person psychologically when their job is to hurt others? Studies of torturers suggest many experience psychological problems, despite attempts to distance themselves emotionally from their work. The job damages not just victims but perpetrators, creating cycles of trauma that extend through societies. In some cultures, former torturers have spoken publicly about their experiences, often expressing remorse. These testimonies provide insight into how ordinary people come to participate in torture. The common themes are gradual escalation, social pressure, ideological justification, and emotional distancing. People don't typically start by torturing. They start with smaller transgressions and gradually become desensitized. The question of justice for torture is complex. Truth and reconciliation processes, as in South Africa after apartheid, prioritize healing over punishment. Criminal trials, as at Nuremberg, prioritize accountability. Both approaches have limitations. Reconciliation can feel like injustice to victims. Trials can be show trials, or limited to low-level perpetrators, while architects of torture policies go free. International criminal law has evolved to address torture, but enforcement is inconsistent. The International Criminal Court can prosecute torture as a crime against humanity, but only in countries that accept its jurisdiction. Powerful countries can simply refuse to cooperate. The result is that justice for torture victims depends largely on the politics and power dynamics of the moment. Throughout these 3,000 years, there have been voices opposing torture: religious leaders, philosophers, reformers, activists. But they've usually been in the minority, and their arguments have often been ignored when fear or anger runs high. The Enlightenment philosopher Cesare Beccaria argued against torture in the 18th century. His arguments were compelling then and remain so now. Yet torture continues. The persistence of torture, despite moral arguments against it, suggests that reason alone isn't sufficient to end it. Emotional drivers, fear, anger, desire for revenge, tribal loyalties, these often override rational moral arguments. To end torture requires not just better arguments, but changes in social structures, power distribution, and collective psychology. The medieval period in Europe deserves deeper examination because it represents perhaps the most thoroughly documented era of institutional torture before the modern age. The Church and various monarchies kept meticulous records, and many of those records survive. They tell us not just what was done, but why, and by whom, and to whom, and what people at the time thought about it. The water cure, used extensively during the Inquisition, involved forcing enormous quantities of water down a person's throat while they were bound on an inclined table. A cloth would be placed over the victim's face, and water poured slowly onto it, creating the sensation of drowning while making it nearly impossible not to swallow. The stomach would distend painfully. Sometimes the interrogators would then beat or jump on the distended stomach, causing the water to erupt back out. Then they'd do it again. Sessions could last hours. What's particularly notable is how this method was discussed in official church documents. There were debates about how much water was permissible, how often the procedure could be repeated, whether certain physical conditions exempted someone. It was bureaucratized, formalized, made into a procedure with guidelines and limitations. The fact that they were having careful, theological and legal discussions about the proper way to simulate drowning tells us something about how normalized it had become. The boot was another common device used across Europe in various forms. The simplest version involved placing the victim's leg in a wooden or metal frame and driving wedges between the leg and the frame, slowly crushing the calf and shin. More elaborate versions used screws to tighten metal plates around the leg. The bones would eventually shatter. Witnesses described hearing the cracking sounds and the way victims' screams would change in pitch as different bones broke. In Scotland, the boot was used well into the 17th century. There are detailed trial records of its use, including in witch trials. One account from 1596 describes the trial of John Fian, a schoolmaster accused of witchcraft. After the boot shattered both his legs, he confessed to meeting with the devil. The next day, he recanted, saying he'd confessed falsely due to the pain. They applied the boot again, this time so severely that his legs were reportedly destroyed beyond any hope of healing. He maintained his recantation and was eventually executed. The question of false confession haunts the entire history of torture. Fian's case is just one of thousands where someone confessed under torture, recanted when the torture stopped, then either maintained their recantation and was killed, or confessed again under renewed torture. The circularity of it, the obvious logical problem, was recognised even at the time, yet the practices continued because they served purposes beyond truth-finding. The thumbscrew, or pillowinks as it was known in Scotland, was a simple device. Metal plates connected by screws, tightened around the thumb or fingers. The small bones would crush relatively easily. What made this particularly useful for interrogators was its portability and the fact that it could be applied while continuing to question the victim. Unlike the boot or the rack, which required the victim to be positioned on a specific device, thumb screws could be applied anywhere, tightened incrementally during questioning. Mary Burton, a servant in New York in 1741, gave testimony during a supposed slave conspiracy trial that led to 34 executions. Her testimony changed multiple times, and some historians believe she was coerced, possibly through the use of thumbscrews or similar devices, though records are incomplete. The conspiracy she described was almost certainly exaggerated or fabricated, but once the legal machinery was in motion, truth became secondary to the need for the authorities to justify their actions. This pattern repeats throughout history. Torture produces the confessions that justify the torture. It becomes self-perpetuating. Someone confesses under duress to meeting with the devil. That confession is used as evidence that devil worship is real and widespread. More people are arrested and tortured until they confess. The confessions prove the conspiracy. The conspiracy justifies more arrests and torture. The system feeds itself. The period of the witch trials in Europe and America, roughly 1450 to 1750, represents torture on an almost industrial scale. Estimates vary wildly, but somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft during this period. The actual number tortured, including those who were tortured but not executed, was certainly much higher. This represents one of the largest sustained torture campaigns in Western history. What's particularly striking is how the torture process worked. The Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1487, essentially provided a manual for identifying and prosecuting witches. It included detailed instructions on how to extract confessions, how to identify false confessions, how to handle recantations. The authors believed they were being thorough and fair, protecting the innocent while rooting out genuine evil. They created a system where virtually anyone accused would eventually confess, and the confessions would confirm the accuser's worst fears. The swimming test, where alleged witches would be bound and thrown into water to see if they floated, is often misunderstood. It wasn't primarily about drowning witches. It was about community participation in the identification process. The entire village would gather. The accused would be paraded, stripped, searched for devil's marks, then taken to a pond or river. The crowd's reaction, their jeers or support, became part of the evidence. Whether the accused floated or sank, they were likely doomed. If they sank, they might drown. If they floated, it was proof of witchcraft. King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, was personally involved in witch trials. He wrote a book, Demonology, describing witchcraft and appropriate punishments. He attended torture sessions. Here was one of the most powerful men in Europe, educated, cultured, patron of Shakespeare, personally participating in the torture of accused witches. He believed absolutely in the reality of demonic conspiracy, and his beliefs shaped policy across his kingdoms. The North Berwick witch trials in Scotland in 1590 were partly instigated by James himself. He believed witches had raised storms to sink the ship carrying his bride from Denmark. Around 70 people were accused. Many were tortured with the boots, thumbscrews and other devices. Several died during torture. Others confessed to impossible crimes, flying through the air, meeting Satan, conspiring to kill the king through black magic. Their confessions, extracted through agony, confirmed James's beliefs and justified further persecution. This is the psychology of torture at work. The powerful become convinced of a threat. They use torture to extract confessions. The confessions confirm the threat. The confirmation justifies more torture. Everyone involved, from the king to the torturers to the crowds watching, believes they're doing necessary work, protecting society from evil. The victims are understood not as innocents being tortured, but as guilty parties being justly punished. Once this mindset is established, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to break. Moving eastward, the Byzantine Empire had its own sophisticated approach to punishment and torture. Blinding was particularly common for political crimes. This wasn't random violence. Blinding served a specific purpose in Byzantine politics. A blinded person couldn't claim the throne, which required physical perfection under Byzantine law. So rather than kill rivals, which might create martyrs or vendetta cycles, emperors would simply blind them. Red-hot irons would be held close to the eyes until the corneas were destroyed. The cruelty here was pragmatic. A blinded rival lived, which could be presented as mercy. They were no longer a threat. They served as a visible warning to others. Several Byzantine emperors were themselves blinded by rivals. Constantine VI was blinded by his own mother, Irene, who wanted to rule alone. Romanos IV was blinded by his stepson's supporters. The frequency of this punishment among the highest levels of society is notable. This wasn't something inflicted only on the powerless. The Vikings, often portrayed as barbarically cruel, actually had relatively codified approaches to punishment. The blood eagle, frequently mentioned in sagas, may or may not have been historical. The description involves cutting the ribs away from the spine and pulling the lungs out through the back to create a wing-like appearance. Some historians believe this was poetic exaggeration rather than an actual practice. Others point to skeletal evidence that might support it. What's interesting is how the Viking sagas describe punishment. There's a matter-of-factness to it, a lack of moral judgment. Someone commits a crime, they're punished, life continues. The emotional register is completely different from Christian medieval texts, which often include explicit moral frameworks and theological justifications. Viking texts just report, this person did this, so this was done to them. The cultural difference in how cruelty is processed and described is as revealing as the acts themselves. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors used terror as strategic policy. Cities that resisted would be destroyed so thoroughly that survivors could spread tales of what happened. This wasn't mindless violence. It was calculated. Submit immediately and you might be incorporated into the empire relatively intact. Resist and everyone dies. Horribly, visibly, memorably. The Mongol practice of building pyramids of severed heads outside conquered cities served multiple purposes. It was a body count proof of victory. It was a warning to the next city. It was demoralization, forcing populations to confront the reality of mass death. The scale was sometimes staggering. After the siege of Baghdad in 1258, estimates suggest anywhere from 90,000 to over 1 million people were killed. The Tigris River reportedly ran black with ink from destroyed libraries, then red with blood. But the Mongols also demonstrated something interesting. When terror served their purposes, they used it. When tolerance served their purposes, they were remarkably tolerant. The same empire that built pyramids of heads also protected trade routes, respected religious diversity, and created systems of law. The cruelty wasn't inherent to Mongol culture. It was a tool deployed when useful and set aside when not. This instrumental use of torture and terror, switching it on and off based on strategic calculation, appears throughout history. The Aztec Empire in Mesoamerica had its own relationship with ritualized violence. Human sacrifice, conducted on a massive scale, was central to Aztec religion and political power. The victims weren't being tortured in the traditional sense. The goal was death, not prolonged suffering. But the spectacle, the public nature of it, the numbers involved, all served to demonstrate state power and reinforce religious ideology. The dedication of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan in 1487 supposedly involved the sacrifice of thousands of captives over 4 days. Spanish accounts claim anywhere from 4,000 to 80,000 victims, though these numbers may be exaggerated. Even if the lower estimates are correct, we're talking about an assembly line of ritual killing, conducted publicly, with crowds watching. The psychological impact on both participants and observers must have been profound. What distinguishes Aztec sacrifice from torture is intention. The Aztecs weren't trying to cause suffering, they were trying to sustain the cosmos. The victims were necessary offerings to keep the sun rising, the crops growing, the world functioning. This doesn't make it less horrific, but it's a different psychological and cultural framework than torture for punishment or information. Understanding these distinctions matters if we want to understand why humans keep finding reasons to hurt each other. The Spanish conquest of the Americas introduced European torture methods to the New World, often combined with local practices in horrific ways. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish colonists control over indigenous labour, created conditions where torture became routine. Native peoples who failed to meet labour quotas, who resisted conversion, who ran away, could be subjected to any number of punishments. Dogs were used as instruments of terror and punishment throughout Spanish colonial territories. Specially trained war dogs would be set on fleeing slaves or resistant indigenous people. Being torn apart by dogs, or even just the threat of it, was used to maintain control. There are detailed accounts from Spanish colonial documents describing these practices, often matter-of-factly, as just another administrative tool. The African slave trade, spanning roughly 1500 to 1800, involved torture on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. The Middle Passage itself, the transport of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, involved conditions that amounted to slow torture for millions. Chained in holds barely tall enough to sit up, in temperatures that could exceed 100 degrees, with minimal food and water surrounded by waste and disease, the death rate averaged around 15%. 15% of 12 million people is nearly 2 million deaths, just during transport. But the ship journey was just the beginning. Plantation slavery in the Americas involved systematic physical punishment as a tool of control. Whipping was routine, often with specific counts for specific infractions, all legally codified. Branding was common, marking enslaved people as property. Mutilation, cutting off ears or parts of feet, was used as punishment for repeated escape attempts. All of this was legal, normal, part of an economic system that existed for centuries. The level of documentation is what makes this particularly harrowing. Plantation records survive, ship logs survive, legal codes survive. We have detailed accounting of how many people were whipped, how many times for what infractions. We have inventories that list enslaved people alongside livestock, noting their scars and brands like identifying marks on cattle. The bureaucratic normality of it, the casual record-keeping of routine cruelty, is as disturbing as the acts themselves. One particularly brutal practice in Caribbean plantations involved staking someone out in the sun, sometimes covering them with sugar or honey to attract insects, leaving them for days. This combined multiple forms of torture: the sun's heat, the insects, immobilization, dehydration, all while being visible to other enslaved people as a warning. The psychological torture of knowing this could happen to you for small infractions, of seeing it happen to others, maintained control as effectively as the physical torture itself. The Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791 and resulted in the first successful slave revolt in history, was extraordinarily violent partly because the enslaved population was responding to generations of accumulated cruelty. When they rose up, they often subjected plantation owners to the same tortures that had been inflicted on enslaved people. This cycle of violence begetting violence, of torture, creating the desire for revenge which manifests as more torture, appears repeatedly in history. Moving to Asia, the Chinese Empire over its thousands of years developed numerous punishment methods, carefully categorized and legally codified. The five punishment system, formalized during the Han Dynasty, created a hierarchy: tattooing, amputation of the nose, amputation of one or both feet, castration, and death. The specific punishment matched the crime, according to carefully worked out legal principles. What's notable is the philosophical framework. Confucian thought emphasized social harmony, respect for hierarchy, proper relationships. Punishment was seen as restoring balance when those relationships were violated. The cruelty had a cosmic purpose, re-establishing the proper order of things. This isn't so different from European Christian justifications for torture as saving souls, or Islamic justifications as implementing divine law. Every culture finds ways to make cruelty meaningful. The kange, a large wooden board locked around the neck, was used throughout Chinese history for public shaming as well as punishment. The person couldn't reach their own face, couldn't lie down comfortably, could barely eat or drink without assistance. They'd wear it for days or weeks, displayed in public places. The physical discomfort was part of it, but the public humiliation, the forced dependence on others, the visibility of punishment, these were equally important. Japan's feudal period saw the development of numerous torture methods, many carefully documented in legal texts. Water torture involved forcing water mixed with salt into the victim's nose until they confessed. The ishidaki, or stone hugging, placed stone slabs on someone forced into a kneeling position until they confessed or died. Crucifixion, as mentioned earlier, but also suspension upside down over pits filled with waste or rotting material, so that victims would breathe the fumes and slowly suffocate or succumb to infection. The Japanese concept of honor meant that some punishments were specifically designed to humiliate as well as cause pain. Forcing samurai to undergo punishments meant for commoners was itself a form of torture, violating their social status. The psychological component, attacking someone's sense of identity and place in society, could be as devastating as physical pain. In medieval Islamic societies, punishments were derived from Sharia law, which specified specific penalties for specific crimes. hand amputation for theft, performed publicly, was meant to be both punishment and deterrent. The method mattered. The amputation was supposed to be done quickly, with minimal suffering beyond the actual severing, and the wound immediately cauterized. There were debates among Islamic scholars about proper methods, about when amputations were and weren't appropriate, about the need for absolute proof before such irreversible punishments. The distinction between prescribed punishments and torture is important in Islamic legal tradition. Torture for the sake of causing pain was generally prohibited. Punishment was supposed to be proportional, specified, and just. But the reality often diverged from the ideal. Various Islamic empires and states used torture extensively, justified through different interpretations of law or simply through the exercise of power, regardless of legal constraints. The Ottoman practice of bastinado, beating the soles of the feet, could be excruciating without causing visible permanent damage. The feet would swell enormously, making walking impossible for weeks. But eventually the swelling would go down, and the person could walk again. This made it useful for punishment without permanent disability, or as a preliminary to further interrogation. The fact that victims could recover meant it could be repeated, unlike amputations or other mutilating punishments. In India, various kingdoms and empires developed their own methods. Crushing by elephant was widespread, but there were variations. Some kingdoms would have elephants step repeatedly on victims, crushing them gradually. Others used specially trained elephants that could prolong the process, responding to commands to press harder or release pressure. The intelligence and trainability of elephants made them instruments of sophisticated cruelty. The practice of gibbeting, hanging bodies in iron cages where they die of exposure and dehydration, then leaving the bodies to rot in place as warnings, was used across Europe and in European colonies for centuries. The cages were often placed at crossroads or other prominent locations. Bodies might hang for months or years, slowly decomposing, visible to everyone passing by. The message was clear. This is what happens to criminals. But the psychological impact of routine exposure to slowly rotting human bodies in public spaces must have been significant. Colonial India under British rule saw the introduction of European punishment methods combined with local traditions. The British believed in the deterrent effect of public punishment. After the 1857 rebellion, often called the Sepoy Mutiny, the British response was systematic and brutal. Captured rebels were executed by various methods, including being blown from cannons, a practice the British had adopted from the Mughals. The number executed is estimated in the thousands, possibly tens of thousands. There's a psychological dimension to adopting local torture methods. The British used cannon execution partly because it was understood locally as particularly shameful, denying victims intact bodies for religious burial rites. They adopted the method specifically because it carried cultural meanings that European executions wouldn't have. This instrumental adoption of culturally specific cruelties appears repeatedly in colonial contexts. The transition to modern torture methods in the 19th and 20th centuries involved both continuity and change. Many traditional physical torture methods persisted, but new methods emerged based on advancing understanding of psychology and physiology. The late 19th century saw serious scientific study of pain, of psychological breakdown, of effective interrogation techniques. This knowledge was rapidly applied to torture. Electrical torture emerged as soon as electricity became widely available. By the early 20th century, electric shocks were being used for torture in various countries. The beauty of it, from a torturer's perspective, was control. You could precisely calibrate the voltage, the duration, the location. You could cause extraordinary pain without leaving visible marks if done carefully. You could repeat it as many times as necessary. As technology improved, so did the sophistication of electrical torture devices. The use of pharmacological agents in torture represents another modern innovation. Drugs that cause pain, that induce fear or paranoia, that break down psychological defenses, all have been used in interrogation and torture. The CIA's MKU-LT RA program experimented with LSD and other psychoactive drugs as potential interrogation aids. The results were often more damaging than traditional torture, leaving victims with permanent psychological damage. Sensory deprivation, systematically studied in the 1950s and 60s, proved devastatingly effective at breaking people down. Prolonged isolation in darkened, soundproofed cells, sometimes for months, can cause hallucinations. Paranoia, permanent psychological damage. It's torture that leaves no physical marks, that can be presented as merely isolation rather than active cruelty, but its effects can be more severe and longer lasting than many traditional torture methods. The Soviet Gulag system, which operated from the 1920s through the 1950s, held millions of prisoners at its peak. While not all prisoners were actively tortured in the traditional sense, the conditions themselves, starvation rations, inadequate shelter in Siberian winter, impossible work quotas, systematic degradation, amounted to slow torture. The death toll is estimated at anywhere from 1 to 2 million, possibly more. These weren't accidental deaths. The system was designed in ways that ensured high mortality. What's particularly notable about the Gulag is how it combined modern bureaucracy with pre-modern brutality. Prisoners had files, were formally sentenced, were tracked through elaborate record systems. But once in the camps, they faced conditions that hadn't changed much since ancient forced labour. The combination of modern administrative systems with primitive, brutal conditions characterises much 20th century torture and imprisonment. Nazi concentration camps took this further. The camps were administered with extraordinary bureaucratic precision. Records were kept of arrivals, deaths, work assignments, medical experiments. Everything was documented. At the same time, the conditions and treatment were designed to dehumanize and ultimately kill. The combination of meticulous record-keeping with systematic cruelty is one of the most disturbing aspects of the Holocaust. The medical experiments conducted in Nazi camps deserve specific attention. Doctors, trained in modern medicine, subjected prisoners to freezing experiments, pressure experiments, infections with deadly diseases, all without anesthesia or consent, observing and documenting the results as the subjects suffered and died. This wasn't traditional torture, it was framed as scientific research. The doctors saw themselves as scientists, not torturers, even as they inflicted extraordinary suffering. After World War II, some of this research was actually used by American and Soviet scientists despite its horrific origins. The ethical implications that knowledge gained through torture might have scientific value created terrible dilemmas. Using the research seemed to validate the suffering. Ignoring it seemed to waste the only possible meaning that could be extracted from those deaths. There are no good answers to these questions, just different forms of moral compromise. The Cold War saw torture proliferate globally, often with superpower support or training. The French in Algeria used torture extensively during the War of Independence from 1954 to 1962. The methods included electric shocks, waterboarding, prolonged standing, systematic beatings. French officers wrote about it later, some defending it as necessary, others expressing profound regret. The debate in France about this history continues today. The Phoenix program during the Vietnam War, run by American and South Vietnamese forces, involved systematic torture of suspected Viet Cong. The program was officially aimed at dismantling enemy infrastructure. In practice, it involved arbitrary detention, torture, and execution of thousands of people, many probably not involved with the Viet Cong at all. The scale and systematic nature of it, all documented in American military records, represents a dark chapter in American history. Latin American dictatorships in the 1970s and 80s developed torture into a science. In Argentina's detention centers, victims would be subjected to sophisticated combinations of physical and psychological torture. The picana, an electric cattle prod, was standard equipment. But the psychological dimension, the disappeared, people taken who simply vanished, created terror beyond just the torture itself. Families never knowing what happened, whether loved ones were alive or dead, was its own form of torture. The training links are worth noting. American military and intelligence agencies trained officers from these dictatorships in interrogation techniques. Some of the training materials have been declassified and show explicit instruction in torture methods, though often using euphemistic language. The global nature of torture, the way techniques and training spread across borders, supported by major powers, reveals how systematic and interconnected these practices were. In the Middle East, Syria's system of detention and torture has been extensively documented through survivor testimony. The technique of the shabar, hanging by wrists tied behind the back, was standard. The dulab, forcing someone to curl inside a tire while being beaten, was common. The forced witnessing of others' torture, including family members, was psychological torture added to physical. The Syrian system operated on such a scale that significant portions of the population experienced it directly or knew someone who had. Iraq under Saddam Hussein used similar methods but added innovations. The use of acid baths, plastic shredders, systematic targeting of entire families for one member's opposition created a system where fear permeated society. The number of people killed in Iraqi prisons during Hussein's rule is estimated at hundreds of thousands. The number tortured was certainly higher. The Iranian prison system, both before and after the 1979 revolution, has extensive documentation of systematic torture. Electric shock, severe beatings, psychological pressure, false executions where someone would go through all the preparation for execution then be returned to their cell, all were routine. The revolutionary government, which had opposed the Shah partly because of his regime's torture, then used many of the same methods against its own opponents. This pattern of revolutionaries becoming torturers is grimly common. Those who suffered torture under one regime, when they gain power, often employ similar methods against their enemies. The cycle perpetuates. Each generation of victims becomes the next generation of torturers, each believing their cause justifies methods they once condemned. Israel's Shin Bet, the Internal Security Service, has been documented using various torture methods, officially termed moderate physical pressure, against Palestinian prisoners. Sleep deprivation, stress positions, violent shaking, exposure to extreme temperatures, all were used, particularly during the 1980s and 90s. Israeli courts eventually banned some methods, but debate continues about what techniques remain in use and whether they constitute torture. The question of euphemism is important here. Moderate physical pressure, enhanced interrogation, stress and duress techniques. All these phrases describe torture while avoiding the word. The linguistic gymnastics governments perform to describe torture without calling it torture reveal the power of the word itself. Torture is illegal, condemned, banned by international law, so governments invent new terminology to describe the same practices. China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang has been documented through survivor testimony and leaked documents. The detention of somewhere between hundreds of thousands to over 1 million people in what the government calls re-education camps involves systematic psychological pressure, political indoctrination, forced labour, and, according to survivors, physical torture. The combination of modern surveillance technology with traditional detention and torture methods creates a particularly comprehensive system of control. North Korea's prison camp system, as described by the small number of survivors who've escaped, involves systematic torture, starvation, forced labour, and execution. The multi-generational aspect, where children are imprisoned for parents' or grandparents' alleged crimes, creates unique forms of suffering. People born in camps who've never known freedom, subjected to systematic cruelty from birth, represent perhaps the purest expression of institutionalized torture. The modern American use of torture, particularly after 9/11, deserves examination because it reveals how quickly democratic societies can adopt torture when afraid. Waterboarding, developed specifically to simulate drowning without actually killing, was used on al-Qaeda suspects held in CIA black sites. Sleep deprivation, stress positions, extreme temperatures, sensory overload, all were employed. The legal memos written to justify these practices, arguing they weren't technically torture, show the intellectual contortions governments perform to rationalize cruelty. Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq became infamous when photographs emerged showing American soldiers abusing Iraqi prisoners. The images of hooded prisoners on boxes, of naked prisoners in humiliating positions, of prisoners being threatened with dogs, shocked many Americans who believed their country didn't torture. But these practices didn't appear spontaneously. They reflected training, techniques, a culture that had normalized certain forms of abuse. Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, opened in 2002, still operates today. The legal ambiguity of its location, technically Cuban territory leased by the US, was specifically chosen to avoid full application of US or international law. Prisoners have been held for years, sometimes decades, without trial. Many have been tortured according to their testimony. The Supreme Court has ruled aspects of the detention illegal, but the facility remains open. The gap between law and practice, between stated values and actual behaviour, remains wide. Rendition, the practice of transporting prisoners to countries known to use torture, allowed democratic governments to outsource torture while maintaining deniability. The US would capture a suspect, fly them to Egypt or Morocco or Syria, where local intelligence services would interrogate using methods Americans officially couldn't use, then share the information. Everyone involved knew what was happening, but the layers of deniability allowed the practice to continue. The spread of torture in the War on Terror wasn't limited to American actions. Many countries used the threat of terrorism to justify crackdowns that included torture. Russia in Chechnya, Egypt against Islamists, Saudi Arabia against dissidents, Turkey against Kurds, all increased torture while framing it as counter-terrorism. The global permissive environment for torture that emerged after 9/11 gave cover to regimes that had been torturing all along. This brings us nearly to the present. Torture hasn't ended. It's evolved, become more sophisticated in some ways, more deniable, more focused on psychological rather than physical damage. But it persists in systems of detention and interrogation around the world. The gap between international law, which clearly prohibits torture, and actual practice, where torture remains common, has not closed. The question of what we do with this knowledge, with this 3,000-year history of cruelty, remains. We can despair, seeing the persistence of torture as evidence of an unchangeable human nature. We can compartmentalize, telling ourselves that these are historical problems largely solved, not relevant to modern life. Or we can face it directly, acknowledging that the capacity for cruelty exists in all human societies, including our own, and that constant vigilance is necessary to prevent its expression. The abolition of torture, where it's occurred, has always required sustained effort. Individual resistors who refused to participate, survivors who testified despite trauma, activists who documented and publicized, legal reformers who created new frameworks, political leaders who enforced prohibitions even when torture seemed expedient. The progress that's been made didn't happen automatically. It happened because people insisted on it, and that progress remains fragile. Fear, anger, the desire for revenge, the dehumanization of enemies, all the factors that have always enabled torture, remain present in human societies. The question isn't whether we're morally superior to our ancestors. It's whether we'll maintain the systems and values that constrain our worst impulses, or whether we'll let those constraints erode when it seems convenient. The history of torture is ultimately a test. It tests our capacity for honesty about human nature, including our own. It tests our commitment to human dignity when that commitment is difficult. It tests whether we'll learn from history or repeat it. The test continues. The answer isn't written. It's being written now by choices made every day, in courtrooms and detention centres and polling places, and individual acts of courage or cowardice. There's a dimension to torture we haven't fully explored yet. The torturers themselves. Who were these people? How did they live with what they did? The historical record provides some answers, and they're more disturbing than the stereotype of sadistic monsters would suggest. In medieval Europe, the role of executioner and torturer was often hereditary, passed from father to son through generations. These families lived on the margins of society, literally and figuratively. They'd be housed outside town walls, forbidden from certain social interactions marked as different. But they were also essential. Someone had to do the work, and society created a class of people whose role it was. The Sanson family in France served as executioners for 6 generations, from 1688 to 1847. Charles-Henri Sanson executed Louis XVI during the French Revolution. His memoir, if authentic, describes his psychological state, the nightmares, the inability to fully participate in normal society. He saw himself as serving justice, yet he was haunted by the thousands of executions he'd performed. The cognitive dissonance, believing you're doing necessary work while being tormented by it, appears throughout testimonies from torturers. In the Ottoman Empire, executioners were often members of the Janissary Corps, elite soldiers taken as children from Christian families, converted to Islam, and raised in service to the Sultan. They'd spend their entire lives in this system. Executing or torturing wasn't their only role, but it was part of their duties. The psychological compartmentalization required, being able to torture someone then return to normal military duties, suggests the human capacity for separating aspects of identity. Modern torturers have sometimes spoken publicly about their experiences, usually years or decades later. Torturers from Argentina's dirty war, from Greek military junta, from various regimes, have given interviews or written memoirs. Common themes emerge: gradual escalation, starting with small cruelties and building to worse. Dehumanization of victims, learning to see them as less than human, ideological conviction that the cause justified the methods, and psychological damage to the torturers themselves. One particularly revealing testimony comes from a former Greek torturer who described how training worked. New recruits would first witness torture, normalizing it. Then they'd participate in minor ways, holding someone down, not directly inflicting pain. Gradually they'd take more active roles. By the time they were primary torturers, they'd been desensitized through incremental steps. The method of creating torturers, making ordinary people capable of extraordinary cruelty, has been refined across centuries. The question of whether torturers enjoy their work is complex. Some testimony suggests that certain individuals did derive satisfaction from causing pain, but most descriptions suggest something different. Emotional numbness, dissociation, a sense of doing unpleasant but necessary work. The banality of it, treating torture as a job, with techniques to learn and quotas to meet, may be more disturbing than imagining sadistic pleasure. There's also the after effect. Many torturers suffer psychological problems later in life. PTSD, depression, substance issues, difficulty forming relationships, all appear frequently. Some express remorse, others rationalize, a few remain convinced they did necessary work, but very few seem psychologically unaffected. The damage torture does extends beyond victims to perpetrators, rippling through societies in ways we're still trying to understand. The role of doctors in torture deserves deeper examination. The Hippocratic Oath explicitly forbids harm, yet doctors have participated in torture throughout history. Sometimes they monitor torture sessions, determining how much a victim can endure before dying, advising torturers when to stop or continue. Sometimes they treat victims between sessions, healing them so torture can continue. Sometimes they actively develop torture methods designed to maximize pain while minimizing death risk. Nazi doctors are the most infamous example, but they're far from alone. Doctors in Soviet gulags, in Latin American dictatorships, in American black sites after 9/11, all have participated in torture. The American Psychological Association and American Medical Association both faced scandals when it emerged that some members had advised on or participated in enhanced interrogation techniques. The complicity of healing professions in torture raises profound questions about professional ethics under political pressure. The justifications doctors give for participation vary. Some claim they were protecting prisoners, that their presence prevented worse abuse. Some say they were following orders, that refusal would have meant their own imprisonment or death. Some believe the cause, counter-terrorism or counterinsurgency or protecting the state, justified extraordinary measures. Very few seem to have simply refused and accepted consequences. The case of Josef Mengele, the Nazi doctor who conducted experiments at Auschwitz, represents an extreme. But he wasn't operating in isolation. He had colleagues, assistants, a system that supported his work. After the war, he escaped to South America and lived for decades, apparently without overwhelming remorse. Letters discovered after his death show he remained convinced his work had been valuable. The capacity for self-justification, for maintaining one's self-image as a good person while doing terrible things, is apparently nearly limitless. Let's consider the infrastructure of torture more carefully. Torture requires tools, spaces, systems. Someone manufactures shackles and stress chairs. Someone designs soundproofed rooms. Someone writes the manuals. Someone trains the personnel. Someone keeps the records. The supply chain of torture, the economic and administrative systems that enable it, involves far more people than just the torturer and victim. In modern times, there's a global market for torture equipment. Companies manufacture restraints, shock devices, chemical irritants, all with legitimate uses in some contexts but also used for torture. Most countries have laws restricting export of torture equipment, but enforcement is inconsistent. The equipment flows to wherever there's demand and money. The people manufacturing it can tell themselves they're just making products, that how those products are used isn't their responsibility. The architecture of torture facilities follows certain patterns. Isolation is common, preventing prisoners from communicating or organizing. Disorientation is common, removing windows, distorting time, eliminating reference points. Visibility between cells is sometimes used, forcing prisoners to witness each other's suffering, though sometimes isolation is preferred. The design choices reflect psychological understanding of how to break human beings most efficiently. There are consultants who advise governments on detention facility design, on interrogation room layout, on security procedures. Most would insist they're promoting lawful detention and interrogation, not torture. But the line is often thin. A facility designed for maximum psychological pressure, for breaking detainees' will, for extracting information through duress, is designed for torture, even if that word is never used. The legal frameworks around torture are worth examining more closely. The UN Convention Against Torture, adopted in 1984, creates international obligations, but it's full of loopholes and limitations. It only covers torture by state actors, not private individuals. It allows countries to define some terms themselves. Enforcement mechanisms are weak. Countries that systematically torture can remain parties to the convention with minimal consequences. The concept of universal jurisdiction, where certain crimes are so serious that any country can prosecute them regardless of where they occurred, theoretically applies to torture. In practice, prosecutions are rare and politically fraught. Augusto Pinochet, the Chilean dictator, was arrested in London in 1998 on a Spanish warrant for torture. But after months of legal battles, he was released on medical grounds and returned to Chile. The attempt to enforce universal jurisdiction for torture largely failed. The US position on torture is particularly interesting from a legal standpoint. The US has signed and ratified the Convention Against Torture, but with reservations and understandings that limit its application. After September 11th, the Justice Department wrote memos defining torture very narrowly, arguing that many coercive techniques didn't qualify. When those memos became public, there was controversy, but few prosecutions followed. The gap between legal theory and political reality remains vast. European countries face similar contradictions. Many participated in CIA extraordinary rendition programs, allowing the US to transport prisoners through their airspace or territory to countries where they'd be tortured. Parliamentary investigations in several European countries documented this complicity. But accountability has been limited. A few low-level officials have faced consequences. Senior leaders who authorize cooperation generally haven't. The role of international courts in addressing torture has been mixed. The International Criminal Court can prosecute torture as a crime against humanity, but only in specific circumstances and for countries that accept its jurisdiction. The European Court of Human Rights has issued many judgments against countries for torture, but enforcement depends on countries voluntarily complying. International criminal tribunals for Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone have prosecuted some torturers, but most go unpunished. The question of reparations for torture victims is legally and morally complex. Some countries have established compensation programs for victims of state torture. Argentina, Chile, Morocco, others have created truth commissions and reparation funds, but the amounts are usually modest, the process often traumatizing, and many victims never receive anything. How do you compensate someone for being tortured? What amount of money could possibly be adequate? There's also intergenerational trauma to consider. Children of torture survivors often experience psychological effects even if they weren't directly harmed. Communities subjected to systematic torture carry that trauma forward. The full accounting of torture's damage extends far beyond the immediate victims and the moments of torture itself. The psychology of confession under torture is fascinating and disturbing. We know that torture produces false confessions, yet the practice continues partly because confessions feel meaningful. There's something psychologically satisfying about extracting an admission of guilt, even when we know it may be false. The confession seems to validate the torture, to prove it was directed at the right person. The Salem witch trials provide a clear example of this dynamic. Torture wasn't officially sanctioned in Massachusetts, but pressure tactics, sleep deprivation, psychological coercion were all used. People confessed to impossible crimes, flying on broomsticks, attending witches' sabbaths, consorting with the devil. These confessions then became evidence used against others. The circularity is obvious in retrospect, but at the time the confessions seemed to confirm the conspiracy. This pattern repeats in more modern contexts. During Stalin's purges in the 1930s, prominent Bolsheviks confessed in show trials to being fascist spies, saboteurs, enemies of the people. The confessions were extracted through prolonged interrogation, threats to family, psychological pressure, sometimes physical torture. Everyone involved, interrogators, judges, audience, knew the confessions were probably false, but the ritual of confession served political purposes beyond truth. The contemporary debate about torture often focuses on the ticking time bomb scenario. If you knew a prisoner had information about an imminent attack, would torture be justified? This hypothetical is almost never how torture actually works. Real torture happens in situations of uncertainty, against people who may or may not have useful information, producing confessions and information that may or may not be true. The clean philosophical scenario bears little resemblance to messy reality. Studies of interrogation effectiveness consistently show that rapport building, deception, patience, these work better than torture for extracting reliable information. Yet torture persists. Why? Partly because it serves purposes beyond information gathering. It demonstrates power. It satisfies desires for revenge. It intimidates populations. It creates spectacles of state authority. The informational justification may be pretense for other motivations. The role of bureaucracy in enabling torture deserves more attention. Torture on a large scale requires administration. Someone schedules interrogation sessions. Someone maintains equipment. Someone files reports. Someone tracks prisoners. Someone authorizes specific techniques. Someone reviews results. The bureaucratic machinery turns individual acts of cruelty into systematic programs. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, developed while watching Adolf Eichmann's trial, applies broadly to torture. Eichmann wasn't a monster in his own eyes. He was a bureaucrat doing his job, following orders, advancing his career. He organized deportations that led to millions of deaths, but he did it through memos and meetings and logistics planning. The ordinariness of it, the bureaucratic normality, is the point. Extraordinary evil doesn't require extraordinary people, just ordinary people in systems that normalize cruelty. This applies to torture across contexts. The CIA officer who writes a memo authorizing specific interrogation techniques isn't thinking of himself as a torturer. He's doing legal analysis, providing guidance, operating within his role. The guard who shackles prisoners in stress positions for hours is following a protocol, implementing approved procedures. Each person in the chain can tell themselves they're just doing their job. The documentation torture produces is itself revealing. The detailed records kept by the Inquisition, by Nazi concentration camps, by Soviet secret police, by various modern intelligence agencies, all serve multiple purposes. They create accountability within systems, showing that procedures were followed. They provide data for analysis and refinement of techniques. They create legal cover, demonstrating that everything was authorized. They satisfy bureaucratic impulses for order and record keeping. But these records also become evidence. The documents that once protected perpetrators by showing they followed proper procedures later become proof of systematic torture. The meticulous record-keeping of the Nazis made prosecutions easier. CIA torture memos, leaked or declassified, documented officially authorized torture. The impulse to document, to create paper trails, to follow bureaucratic norms, creates evidence that may later be used against torturers and those who authorized them. The tension between secrecy and documentation characterizes modern torture. Regimes want records for internal purposes but don't want those records public. The result is often elaborate classification systems, compartmentalization, destruction of evidence. But information tends to leak. Whistleblowers emerge, documents get declassified, technology makes secrets harder to keep. The gap between what governments officially acknowledge and what actually happens narrows over time, though usually too late for real-time accountability. Survivor testimony plays a crucial role in documenting torture. When official records don't exist or remain classified, when governments deny torture occurred, survivors who speak out provide the only evidence. But testimony is fraught with challenges. Memory is imperfect, especially traumatic memory. Survivors may not know where they were held, who tortured them, exact dates or methods. Their testimony can be questioned, dismissed as unreliable or motivated by anti-government bias. Yet collectively, survivor testimony has documented torture across contexts. Thousands of survivors of Chile's dictatorship have testified. Hundreds of Guantanamo detainees have described their treatment. Survivors of ISIS captivity, of Syrian prisons, of Chinese detention facilities, all have spoken out. The consistency of accounts, the specific details that match across testimonies, the psychological profiles consistent with torture trauma, all provide credible evidence even without official documentation. The process of testifying itself can be re-traumatizing. Survivors must relive experiences often in adversarial legal settings, their credibility questioned, their motives examined. Some survivors choose silence rather than testimony, unable or unwilling to speak about what happened. Others feel compelled to testify despite the cost, believing it's necessary for justice, for historical record, for preventing future torture. There's also the question of vicarious trauma for those who document torture. Investigators, lawyers, human rights workers, journalists, all who immerse themselves in testimony and evidence, often experience psychological effects. Hearing detailed descriptions of torture, reviewing photographic or video evidence, conducting interviews with survivors takes a toll. The accumulated weight of these stories, the inability to forget what you've learned, creates its own form of suffering. Let's return to some specific historical cases that reveal broader patterns. The torture of Damiens the Regicide in 1757 France was documented in extraordinary detail. Robert-François Damiens attempted to assassinate King Louis XV with a knife, only wounding him slightly. His punishment was designed to be exemplary, public torture lasting hours, involving red-hot pincers tearing his flesh, molten lead and boiling oil poured into his wounds, horses pulling his limbs in 4 directions. The execution took hours because his body wouldn't separate cleanly. The crowd's reaction was reportedly mixed, some horrified, some entertained. The level of detail in the official record of Damiens' execution is striking. Every step was planned, authorized, witnessed, recorded. The point was to demonstrate royal power, to show what happened to those who attacked the king. But reactions to the execution contributed to growing opposition to such extreme public torture. Michel Foucault used it as the opening case study in Discipline and Punish, arguing it represented a form of power that was becoming obsolete even as it was performed. The transition from spectacular public torture to hidden disciplinary punishment represents a major shift in how power operates. Rather than destroying bodies publicly, modern power operates through surveillance, normalization, internalized discipline. Prisons replaced public executions. Psychological pressure replaced physical torture, or more accurately, supplemented it, because physical torture never actually disappeared. The case of the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya during the 1950s reveals how colonial powers used torture systematically, while denying it publicly. The British established detention camps where suspected rebels were subjected to beating, forced labour, starvation, various forms of physical and psychological torture. Official policy was to rehabilitate detainees through escalating pressure until they renounced the rebellion. The documented death rate was high, the actual rate probably higher. For decades, the British government denied systematic torture occurred in Kenya. When historians presented evidence, official documents were said not to exist. In 2011, the British government admitted that documents had been deliberately hidden or destroyed. In 2013, the British government settled with survivors, paying compensation and acknowledging that torture occurred. The case reveals how long governments can successfully deny documented torture, and how difficult it is for survivors to achieve acknowledgement and justice. The Argentine military dictatorship's practice of death flights represents a particular form of cruelty, making people disappear without trace. Prisoners would be drugged, loaded onto planes, flown over the Atlantic and pushed out. No bodies, no graves, no closure for families. The psychological torture of relatives, never knowing for certain what happened, wondering if loved ones might still be alive, was deliberate. Some pilots have since confessed, describing pushing unconscious prisoners from planes into the ocean. The term disappeared became associated with Latin American dictatorships, but the practice exists globally. When someone is taken by security forces and never seen again, when the government denies holding them, when no body is ever produced, families live in suspended grief. The ambiguity is itself a form of torture, applied to the families rather than the victim. Some relatives search for decades, never accepting death without proof, unable to move forward. In Sri Lanka, during and after the civil war, thousands of people disappeared. Both sides, government forces and Tamil tigers, disappeared perceived enemies. Families still search for information. Mass graves have been discovered, but identification is difficult or impossible. The disappeared haunt societies, preventing closure, keeping wounds open, transmitting trauma across generations. The practice of taking hostages and demanding concessions under threat of torture or death has ancient roots, but continues today. ISIS videos of executions and torture, released deliberately for propaganda purposes, represent a modern version of this. The videos served multiple purposes. They terrorized enemies, they satisfied supporters' desires for revenge, they attracted certain recruits, they demonstrated power and commitment. The filming and distribution of torture represents a return to public spectacle, though mediated through technology rather than physical presence. The response to these videos revealed something about modern sensibilities. Many people found them unwatchable, the cruelty too extreme. Yet the videos circulated widely. There was simultaneous revulsion and fascination, horror and compulsion to watch. This mirrors historical reactions to public torture and execution, condemned morally yet attended eagerly. Human psychology around witnessing cruelty remains complex and contradictory. The torture of prisoners at Abu Ghraib by American soldiers was photographed by the perpetrators themselves. They took pictures of themselves with tortured prisoners as trophies or souvenirs, like vacation photos. When these images leaked, they sparked international outrage. But the fact that soldiers felt comfortable photographing themselves, torturing prisoners, suggests how normalized it had become for them. They weren't hiding their actions from each other. They were documenting and celebrating them. This returns us to the question of how ordinary people become capable of torture. The soldiers at Abu Ghraib weren't psychopaths. They were regular enlisted personnel, reservists called to active duty, mostly young, mostly without specialized training. They were placed in a stressful situation, given unclear guidance, exposed to a culture where abuse was tolerated or encouraged, and they adapted. Within months, they were doing things that would have been unthinkable to them before deployment. The Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted in 1971 by Philip Zimbardo, attempted to study this phenomenon. College students were randomly assigned to play guards or prisoners in a simulated prison. Within days, the guards were engaging in psychological abuse. The experiment was stopped early because the situation had become ethically concerning. The methodology and conclusions have been criticized, but the experiment suggested how quickly ordinary people can abuse power over others when given opportunity and implicit permission. However, more recent analysis suggests the Stanford experiment was less spontaneous than originally portrayed. Zimbardo apparently encouraged certain behaviors, and participants later said they were playing roles they thought were expected. This doesn't invalidate the insight that situations can enable cruelty, but it complicates it. People respond to perceived expectations, to what they think is wanted from them. When authority figures suggest or tolerate abuse, people read that as permission. The Milgram experiment, also from the early 1960s, tested obedience to authority. Participants were told to administer increasingly powerful electric shocks to a learner, actually an actor, whenever they made mistakes. Despite hearing screams and pleas to stop, the majority of participants continued to the highest shock levels when urged on by the experimenter. The experiment suggested that ordinary people would inflict pain on innocents simply because an authority figure told them to. These experiments, despite their limitations, pointed to uncomfortable truths about human nature. We're more capable of cruelty than we'd like to believe, especially when authority endorses it, when it's incremental, when we can diffuse responsibility, when victims are dehumanized or distant. The insights from psychology research help explain how torture happens on a large scale. Not because societies are full of sadists, but because ordinary people can be induced to participate under the right conditions. This understanding doesn't excuse torture, but it does suggest what's required to prevent it. Strong legal prohibitions, accountability for superiors who authorize or tolerate it, training that explicitly forbids abuse, cultures that encourage reporting misconduct, swift punishment for violations. Without these safeguards, the natural tendency toward obedience and conformity can enable torture. The role of ideology in enabling torture cannot be overstated. When people believe they're fighting an existential threat, protecting their nation or faith or way of life against fundamental evil, extreme measures become justifiable in their minds. This pattern appears across every context we've examined. Inquisitors saving souls, colonizers civilizing savages, revolutionaries building utopia, counter-terrorism officials protecting innocents. The ideology provides not just justification but moral urgency. Not torturing becomes the unethical choice, allowing evil to triumph. This inversion, where cruelty becomes virtue and restraint becomes moral failure, is how torture becomes normalized within institutions. People who torture see themselves as heroes making hard choices, sacrificing their own humanity for the greater good. Resistance to torture, when it happens, often comes from those who maintain human connection with victims. Guards who see prisoners as people struggle to abuse them. Interrogators who build rapport rarely torture. Societies that maintain legal protections and accountability structures prevent torture more effectively than those relying solely on the moral character of individual officers. There have been many individual resistors throughout history. Military personnel who refused orders to torture, even at risk to themselves. Prison guards who reported abuse. Intelligence officers who became whistleblowers. Their stories receive less attention than those of torturers and victims, but they demonstrate that even in systems that enable torture, individual moral courage remains possible. Hugh Thompson, the helicopter pilot who intervened to stop the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, represents this kind of courage. He positioned his helicopter between American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians, ordering his gunner to fire on the Americans if they continued killing. He reported what he'd witnessed, despite knowing it would damage his career. For years, he was condemned by many Americans for betraying his fellow soldiers. His courage in choosing humanity over loyalty, in acting against authority and camaraderie to prevent atrocity, shows what resistance looks like in practice. But resistors pay costs. Thompson faced years of hostility and threats. Whistleblowers who've exposed torture programs have been prosecuted, imprisoned, exiled. Speaking out against torture, especially from within systems that practice it, requires extraordinary courage precisely because the personal costs are often severe. The lack of protection and support for whistleblowers enables torture to continue. The question of forgiveness and reconciliation after systematic torture divides communities. Some survivors insist on prosecution and punishment. Others prefer truth-telling and acknowledgement. Some seek forgiveness and healing. There's no single right answer, and survivors themselves disagree. What seems clear is that ignoring the past, pretending torture didn't happen, rarely works. The wounds remain, the trauma transmits, the society cannot fully move forward. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, established after apartheid ended, allowed perpetrators to confess their crimes in exchange for amnesty. The process was controversial. Many victims felt betrayed that torturers wouldn't face criminal justice. But the Commission created a public record, gave survivors a platform to tell their stories, and forced society to confront what had been done. Whether it achieved true reconciliation is debatable, but it represented a serious attempt to deal with mass torture and violence. Other countries have tried different approaches. Some, like Argentina, eventually prosecuted former military leaders decades after their crimes. Some, like Spain, maintained a pact of silence about Franco-era torture, avoiding prosecutions in the interest of stability. Some, like Rwanda after the genocide, combined traditional community justice with formal prosecutions. Each approach has advocates and critics. None fully satisfies all demands for justice, truth, and healing. The economic aftermath of torture regimes is rarely discussed but significant. Countries that have engaged in systematic torture often face years of instability, difficulty attracting investment, brain drain as educated citizens emigrate. The damage to social trust, to institutional legitimacy, to psychological health of the population has economic consequences that persist for generations. Tourism to former torture sites, places like Robben Island in South Africa or Tuol Sleng in Cambodia, raises ethical questions. These sites serve educational purposes, preserving memory, teaching history. But they also become tourist attractions, places people visit on vacation. The commodification of suffering, selling tickets to see where people were tortured, feels uncomfortable. Yet without such sites, memory fades. The tension between preservation and exploitation remains unresolved. We're approaching the limits of what can be said about 3,000 years of torture. We could continue cataloguing methods, listing regimes, detailing cases. But at some point the accumulation of horror becomes numbing rather than enlightening. The patterns have emerged, the insights have been drawn. What remains is the question of what we do with this knowledge. The persistence of torture across human history suggests it's not an aberration we'll simply outgrow. It's a capacity that requires active suppression, constant vigilance, structural constraints. The question isn't whether humans are capable of torture. We clearly are. The question is whether we'll build and maintain systems that prevent it. Those systems include law, but law alone isn't sufficient. They include culture, norms about human dignity that transcend legal requirements. They include education, ensuring people understand history and human rights. They include accountability, making it genuinely risky to torture. They include whistleblower protections, creating paths for insiders to report abuse. They include international cooperation, preventing countries from outsourcing torture or ignoring it in allies. Most importantly, they include individual choice. Every person who's been put in a position to torture has faced a choice: participate or refuse. Most participate, some refuse. The ratio between those groups determines whether torture happens in any specific context. Building cultures where more people refuse, where the social and professional costs of refusing are bearable, while the costs of participating are severe, is perhaps the most important factor in preventing torture. The choice isn't just for those directly involved. Citizens of democracies face choices too. Do we look away when our governments torture, or do we insist on accountability? Do we accept euphemisms and legal technicalities, or do we call torture what it is? Do we allow fear to override principles, or do we maintain commitments to human rights even when afraid? These choices, made collectively, shape whether torture continues or ends. The history of torture is ultimately a history of choices. The Assyrians chose terror as policy. Medieval inquisitors chose theology over mercy. Colonial powers chose domination over dignity. 20th century regimes chose efficiency over humanity. And in each case, individuals went along, found justifications, participated. But in each case, some individuals refused, resisted, maintained their humanity despite pressure to abandon it. 3,000 years shows us both possibilities. We can continue choosing cruelty, finding new justifications, new methods, new victims. Or we can choose differently, can build societies where torture is genuinely unthinkable, where the systems and culture and law and individual choices all align against it. The history doesn't determine which path we'll take. We determine that through choices we make now and in the future. Continuing from previous content. There's an aspect of torture that becomes more visible when you examine it across centuries: the relationship between innovation and cruelty. Every major technological advance in human history has been rapidly adapted for causing suffering. The wheel, metallurgy, chemistry, electricity, psychology, pharmacology, each breakthrough brought new possibilities for torture within years, sometimes months, of its development. The breaking wheel, used extensively in Europe from the Middle Ages through the 18th century, represents early mechanical engineering applied to execution. The condemned would be tied to a large wooden wheel. An executioner would use an iron bar to break the bones of their arms and legs, carefully, methodically, working through each limb. The number of blows was sometimes specified by sentence: 8 blows, 40 blows. The precision itself is telling. After the bones were shattered, the body would be woven through the spokes of the wheel, which would then be raised on a pole for public display. Death could take days. What's notable is the engineering precision. The wheel had to be the right size, the right strength. The bars had to be heavy enough to break bones, but not so heavy as to kill quickly. There were specialists who knew the technique, how to break bones most effectively, where to strike. This was craftsmanship applied to suffering. The same skills that built cathedrals and aqueducts were used to design torture devices. The brazen bull, allegedly invented in ancient Greece, represents even earlier technological application to torture. A hollow bronze bull with an opening in the side. The victim would be placed inside, the opening sealed, and a fire lit beneath. As the victim screamed, the sounds would resonate through tubes designed to make them sound like the bull bellowing. Whether this device was actually used as described is debated, but its legend persisted for centuries, inspiring similar devices in other cultures. The idea that someone would engineer acoustics to transform screams into animal sounds reveals a particular kind of cruelty, one that combines technical skill with deliberate dehumanization. Chemistry's contribution to torture is substantial. Lime, acid, various caustic substances have been used to cause burns or dissolve bodies. The development of modern chemistry in the 18th and 19th centuries led to more sophisticated chemical torture. Gases that cause respiratory distress, drugs that induce specific psychological states, compounds that increase pain sensitivity, all were developed and used. The use of chemical weapons in World War I, while not torture in the technical sense, involved the deliberate infliction of extreme suffering on an industrial scale. Chlorine gas, phosgene, mustard gas, these caused death by asphyxiation or chemical burns, processes that could take hours or days. The soldiers who died from gas attacks essentially drowned in fluid from their own destroyed lung tissue, or suffered burns that covered their entire respiratory system. The development and deployment of these weapons involved chemists, engineers, military strategists, all contributing technical expertise to creating suffering. Later, chemical agents were refined for use in interrogation and crowd control. Tear gas, pepper spray, various incapacitating agents walk the line between crowd control and torture depending on concentration and duration of exposure. The development of chemical agents specifically for use against humans, calibrated to cause pain without typically causing death, represents applied chemistry in service of control through suffering. Electricity's adaptation to torture was remarkably rapid. Within a few decades of electricity becoming widely available, it was being used to cause pain. Early uses were sometimes framed as medical, attempting to treat mental illness or other conditions through electric shocks. The line between treatment and torture was thin. By the early 20th century, electric shock was an established torture method in various countries. The refinement of electrical torture over the 20th century shows technical sophistication. Different voltages and amperages produce different effects. Too much current kills quickly. Too little doesn't cause sufficient pain. Torturers learn to calibrate precisely, to apply electricity to specific body parts for maximum pain with minimal visible damage. The equipment evolved from crude car batteries and wires to sophisticated devices designed specifically for torture, manufactured by companies, sold to governments. The development of the electric chair for execution in the United States, first used in 1890, was originally promoted as more humane than hanging. Thomas Edison was involved in demonstrations attempting to show that alternating current was dangerous, partly to discredit his rival George Westinghouse. The first execution of William Kemmler was botched. The initial current didn't kill him. He was still breathing, still conscious. They had to apply current again. The process took 8 minutes. Witnesses described the smell of burning flesh, the sounds Kemmler made. The humane execution method turned out to be anything but. Yet the electric chair continued to be used for decades, refined but never perfected. Execution still sometimes went wrong, took too long, caused visible suffering. The gap between the promise of technological solutions, quick, clean, humane death, and the reality of burning human bodies with electricity remained. But the technological framing allowed people to believe they were being progressive, scientific, modern, even as they were causing terrible suffering. Sound has been weaponized in interesting ways. Prolonged exposure to loud noise can cause severe psychological and physical distress. Some interrogation techniques involve blasting music or white noise at extreme volumes for hours or days. This causes sleep deprivation, disorientation, pain in the ears and head, eventually psychological breakdown. It's torture through physics, using our understanding of sound waves and human hearing to cause suffering. More sophisticated acoustic weapons have been developed. Devices that emit sounds at specific frequencies can cause nausea, disorientation, pain. Some are marketed for crowd control. The line between controlling a crowd and torturing individuals becomes blurred when the weapon causes severe pain to anyone in its range, regardless of whether they're actually threatening anything. Temperature extremes have always been used in torture, but modern technology allows precise control. Rooms can be kept at specific temperatures, adjusted gradually or suddenly. Combined with stripping prisoners of clothing, with poor nutrition that affects the body's ability to regulate temperature, with alternating heat and cold, this becomes a sophisticated torture method. The victim isn't being beaten or cut, there are no visible marks, but the suffering can be extreme and the health effects serious. The development of stress positions reflects psychological and physiological understanding. Forcing someone to stand for extended periods causes increasing pain in the legs and back, eventually causing joints to swell and muscles to spasm. Making someone hold awkward positions, arms extended, squatting, causes rapid muscle fatigue and severe cramping. These methods were refined through experimentation, learning exactly how long various positions could be maintained before physical collapse, how to maximize suffering while avoiding death or permanent injury that would be visible. Sensory deprivation, as mentioned earlier, was studied scientifically in the 1950s and 60s. Researchers wanted to understand how humans respond to isolation from sensory input. The findings, that people rapidly begin hallucinating and experiencing severe psychological distress, were quickly applied to interrogation. Isolation cells designed to minimize sensory input became standard in various prison and detention systems. The science of breaking people through loneliness and sensory absence was formalized, taught, implemented systematically. The opposite approach, sensory overload, has also been used. Constant bright lights, constant noise, constant activity preventing sleep, all can break someone down psychologically. The combination, alternating between sensory deprivation and overload, creates disorientation and psychological instability. The victim never knows what's coming next, can't adapt, can't find equilibrium. This technique reflects sophisticated understanding of human psychology applied to causing breakdown. Medical knowledge has been applied to keeping torture victims alive longer. Understanding of fluid replacement means severe dehydration can be periodically reversed. Understanding of infection means wounds can be treated just enough to prevent death. Understanding of pain means methods can be calibrated to maximize suffering while avoiding shock or cardiac arrest that would end the session prematurely. The extension of torture through medical intervention represents a particularly disturbing application of healing knowledge. Drugs have been used both as torture in themselves and as aids to other torture. Truth serums, drugs supposed to make people unable to lie, have been experimented with extensively. Most don't work as advertised. People under their influence confabulate as much as tell truth, but they continue to be used. Drugs that increase anxiety, induce paranoia, cause physical distress, have all been employed in interrogation. The pharmacological manipulation of consciousness and emotion represents torture through chemistry. The development of waterboarding technique reflects refinement over time. The basic concept simulating drowning is ancient, but the modern method, developed and documented by various intelligence agencies, is precisely calibrated. The angle of incline, the rate of water application, the duration of each session, the timing of repetitions, all have been studied and optimized. This isn't crude cruelty, it's engineered suffering based on understanding of human physiology and psychology. Photography and video have changed torture in important ways. The Abu Ghraib photos, ISIS execution videos, these represent torture becoming image, becoming data that can be stored, transmitted, analyzed. The perpetrators document their own actions, sometimes as trophies, sometimes as proof of compliance with orders, sometimes for propaganda. The victim's suffering becomes content, consumable, shareable. This digital afterlife of torture, images that can never be fully erased, circulating indefinitely online, adds a dimension of perpetual victimization. Surveillance technology enables new forms of control that some argue constitute psychological torture. Knowing you're constantly watched, that any dissent will be recorded and potentially punished, creates internalized oppression. You monitor your own thoughts, police your own behavior, torture yourself to avoid external torture. The panopticon concept, a prison design where guards can observe all prisoners without prisoners knowing when they're being observed, has been realized through modern surveillance technology. China's social credit system, while not torture in any traditional sense, represents control through technological monitoring and consequences. Behavior is tracked, scored, determines access to services and opportunities. The psychological pressure of constant evaluation, of consequences for minor infractions, of inability to escape observation, creates a form of oppression that some argue approaches torture in its psychological effects. Whether this is torture or merely authoritarian control is debatable, but it represents how technology enables new forms of sustained pressure on individuals. Cyber torture is an emerging concept. Can psychological torture be conducted entirely online? Doxing, swatting, coordinated harassment campaigns, these can cause severe psychological distress. Death threats, violent imagery, exposure of private information, sustained over months or years, can create symptoms similar to traditional torture: anxiety, depression, PTSD, fear for physical safety. Whether this constitutes torture is legally unsettled, but the psychological effects on victims can be severe and lasting. The question of what counts as torture continues to evolve as new methods emerge. Is solitary confinement torture? Major human rights organisations say yes, particularly prolonged isolation. The UN has suggested any isolation beyond 15 days constitutes torture, yet many countries use solitary confinement routinely, for months or years. The gap between human rights standards and actual practice remains enormous. Are conditions in overcrowded prisons torture? When people are packed so tightly they can't lie down, when sanitation is inadequate, when disease spreads unchecked, when violence is routine and staff don't intervene, does that constitute torture? Legally, it's often classified as cruel and unusual punishment rather than torture, but the suffering is real and often intentional, at least in the sense that authorities know what conditions exist and choose not to change them. Immigration detention, particularly of families and children, raises similar questions. When people are held in facilities with inadequate food, medical care, sanitation, when families are separated, when detention lasts months or years, when people fleeing danger are imprisoned indefinitely, does that constitute torture? Advocates say yes. Governments say no, it's just detention pending asylum proceedings. The terminology matters legally but not experientially to those enduring the conditions. The militarization of police in many countries has brought interrogation techniques from military and intelligence contexts into domestic law enforcement. In some jurisdictions, police use methods, prolonged interrogation, psychological pressure, deception, isolation, that resemble torture techniques. The line between aggressive interrogation and torture is contested. Police departments call their methods lawful and necessary. Critics call them torture. The people subjected to them experience them as traumatic regardless of terminology. The school-to-prison pipeline in the United States, the way disciplinary practices in schools mirror criminal justice approaches, has been criticized as traumatizing children. While not torture, the use of restraints on children, isolation rooms, police presence in schools creates exposure to violence and control that can be psychologically damaging. The argument is that we're training children to accept coercive treatment, normalizing state violence from a young age. Conversion therapy, attempts to change sexual orientation or gender identity through psychological pressure, has been classified as torture by several UN bodies. The methods involve shame, punishment for expressed identity, sometimes including physical abuse or forced medication. Survivors describe severe psychological trauma. Many countries have banned the practice as harmful and ineffective, but it continues in others, sometimes sanctioned by religious institutions or conducted by licensed therapists. The treatment of people with mental illness in some institutional settings arguably constitutes torture. Forced medication with substances that have severe side effects, prolonged physical restraints, isolation, lack of mental health treatment. These practices continue in psychiatric facilities, prisons, and immigration detention. The vulnerability of people with mental illness, the power imbalance, the often permanent nature of detention, all create conditions where abuse is common and accountability rare. Elder abuse in care facilities sometimes involves treatment that could be classified as torture, neglect leading to malnutrition and bed sores, physical restraints used for convenience rather than necessity, verbal abuse and humiliation. The elderly, especially those with dementia, are vulnerable and unable to effectively complain. The institutional nature of the problem, the financial pressures on facilities, the low pay and high turnover of staff all contribute to conditions where abuse happens routinely. The treatment of people with severe disabilities, both physical and intellectual, in some institutional settings involves similar issues: restraints, isolation, lack of stimulation, neglect of basic needs, sometimes outright physical abuse. The visibility is low, the victims often unable to communicate about their treatment, families sometimes unaware or complicit. The systematic nature of this abuse, happening in facilities ostensibly designed to care for vulnerable people, represents a particular betrayal of trust. These modern forms of suffering, whether we classify them as torture or not, reveal that the human capacity for causing harm to the vulnerable persists. The specific methods evolve, the legal classifications change, but the fundamental dynamic, powerful people or institutions causing suffering to powerless people, remains constant. The technology changes, The justifications update, but the underlying pattern continues. The question of complicity extends beyond direct perpetrators. Who profits from torture? Private contractors who build detention facilities, companies that manufacture restraints and surveillance equipment, corporations that supply prisons and detention centres, investors who own stock in these companies, all participate economically in systems that cause suffering. The diffusion of responsibility through corporate structures and investment portfolios allows widespread complicity while minimising individual accountability. Academic institutions that train interrogators, that conduct research used to refine coercive techniques, that remain silent about abuse, all participate in the enabling torture. The knowledge produced in universities about psychology, about physiology, about social control gets applied in interrogation rooms and prisons. Some academics actively resist this application of their research. Many simply publish their findings and don't consider downstream uses. Media institutions that report on torture face difficult choices. Detailed reporting can inform public debate, but might also normalise torture or provide how-to information. Avoiding graphic details protects audiences, but might minimise the horror and reduce accountability pressure. Showing images of torture victims raises ethical questions about consent and dignity. The balance between informing the public and respecting victims' privacy and dignity has no perfect solution. Religious institutions have been both enablers of and resistors to torture. The Spanish Inquisition was run by the Catholic Church. Religious justifications have been used for torture across faiths and centuries. But religious figures and institutions have also opposed torture, provided sanctuary to victims, advocated for abolition. The role of religion in torture history is complex, neither purely enabling nor purely resisting. The economic costs of torture, rarely calculated, are substantial. Training torturers costs money. Building and maintaining detention facilities costs money. Legal battles over torture cost money. Medical and psychological treatment for survivors costs money. The social instability that often follows systematic torture costs money. Whether torture even achieves its stated goals, deterrence, information, control, is questionable. The cost-benefit analysis, if conducted honestly, would likely argue against torture on purely practical grounds. But cost-benefit analysis isn't how torture decisions are made. They're made in contexts of fear, anger, perceived emergency, desire for revenge, dehumanization of enemies. Rational calculation gives way to emotional reaction and ideological commitment. The stated justifications, gathering intelligence, preventing attacks, maintaining order, often mask other motivations: punishment, demonstration of power, satisfaction of anger, enforcement of social hierarchies. The aestheticization of torture in popular culture is worth considering. Torture scenes in movies and television, in video games, in true crime content, all present torture as entertainment. Sometimes it's portrayed as heroic, the protagonist torturing to save innocence. Sometimes it's portrayed as disturbing but fascinating. Rarely is it shown with realistic consequences: the long-term trauma, the unreliable information, the moral corruption of participants. This cultural normalization of torture, making it consumable entertainment, may contribute to public acceptance of real torture. If torture is routine in media, familiar and often justified, audiences may bring those attitudes to real-world torture debates. The heroes torture, and it works, and they remain heroes. This narrative, repeated across thousands of hours of content, shapes perceptions even as people consciously recognize fiction isn't reality. The counter-argument is that depicting torture realistically, showing consequences accurately, might actually build opposition to real torture. But most fictional torture isn't realistic. It's dramatic, often justified, rarely shows long-term effects on victims or perpetrators. The gap between fictional torture and real torture allows audiences to enjoy fictional violence while remaining unaware of real suffering. We're near the end now, truly. We've travelled from ancient Assyria to modern black sites, from breaking wheels to waterboarding, from public spectacles to secret renditions. We've seen how every culture, every era, every ideology has found reasons to torture. We've seen how ordinary people become torturers, how bureaucracies enable it, how technology refines it, how societies rationalise it. The accumulation of this knowledge, The weight of 3,000 years of systematic cruelty could lead to despair. If torture has been this constant, this widespread, this adaptable, how can it ever truly end? But despair isn't the only possible response. Understanding is necessary for prevention. Knowing what enables torture helps us recognize and resist those conditions. Seeing the patterns helps us identify them emerging. The trajectory isn't entirely bleak. Torture is officially banned in more places than ever before. International legal frameworks exist even if imperfectly enforced. More people understand torture as fundamentally wrong rather than sometimes necessary. Survivor testimony is taken more seriously. Accountability, while still rare, happens more often than in past centuries. Progress is real even if incomplete. The fight against torture isn't won, but it's being fought. Organizations document abuses, advocate for survivors, pressure governments. Whistleblowers continue exposing illegal practices despite personal costs. Some countries have genuinely ended torture, maintained those prohibitions for decades, demonstrated it's possible. The existence of societies that don't torture proves it's a choice, not an inevitability. Individual resistance matters. Every person who refuses orders to torture, every official who reports abuse, every citizen who votes based on human rights concerns contributes to building systems where torture becomes harder. Collective action, sustained over time, can change norms, strengthen laws, create accountability. The question isn't whether one person can end torture, it's whether each person will make choices that move toward ending it. Thank you for staying through this extended journey. These hours you've spent learning this history, uncomfortable and disturbing as it's been, matter. Knowledge creates responsibility. You know now what humans are capable of, what conditions enable torture, what it takes to resist. That knowledge isn't neutral, it demands response, demands that you carry it forward into choices you make, conversations you have, positions you take, comment where you are, what time it is there now, and what you'll carry forward from this. The history doesn't change, but what we do with it, how we let it inform our understanding and our choices, that's still being written. Thank you for making this difficult journey. May the knowledge serve wisdom and lead toward justice.